Welcome to Grifter or Gifted, the show that, well, we take a deep dive into some of the most interesting figures of our time. And today we're really getting into someone who's been making headlines, Judge Aileen Cannon.
Yeah, she's a fascinating figure because she's at the center of this whole debate about the judiciary, and especially when it comes to politically charged cases.
Right, and it's not just about, like her rulings, but what they could mean for the future of the courts in general.
Exactly.
So before we get into all of that, can we just rewind a bit? Who is Aileen Cannon?
Well, she was born in Colombia but raised in Florida, and she went to some pretty impressive schools. Graduated from the University of Michigan Law School, and this is interesting. She was a member of the Federalist Society even back then.
Ah, okay. So that kind of gives us a little insight into her potential leanings. But I mean, lots of lawyers belong to organizations like that. So what about her actual career? Anything in her work before becoming a judge that kind of foreshadowed, this level of controversy?
Well, she was a federal prosecutor for almost a decade, handled a pretty wide range of cases, actually.
Yeah.
Everything from drug trafficking to white-collar crime.
So she wasn't just stuck in one legal niche. Sounds like she had to be pretty versatile.
Yeah, definitely. It's important to acknowledge that experience because her critics will say that she lacks depth. But I mean, her background kind of suggests otherwise, right?
Okay, so we've got this seemingly competent prosecutor who then gets appointed to a federal judgeship by Trump in 2020. And that's when things really start to heat up.
Exactly. It's her involvement in the Trump-related cases, particularly the Mar-a-Lago documents case, that really put her in the national spotlight.
And I mean, this wasn't just the usual political back and forth. Legal experts from, across the spectrum were raising concerns about her rulings.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the most common accusations was that she was exceeding her jurisdiction.
Okay, can you give me an example? Because for someone, outside the legal world, that sounds pretty abstract.
Sure. A prime example is her decision to grant Trump's request for a special master to review those documents seized from Mar-a-Lago.
Okay, so a special master.
Yeah, basically it's an independent third party appointed by the court to review the evidence. And a lot of times it's to make sure that privileged information, like attorney-client communications, isn't disclosed.
Okay, so on the surface, that sounds, pretty reasonable. So what was the problem?
Well, the problem is that special masters aren't typically used in cases like this. I mean, the Justice Department, they had already taken steps to, filter out those potentially privileged documents.
So it seems like she was giving Trump special treatment that wasn't warranted.
That's what a lot of people were saying. And then, of course, you have the fact that a higher court, the 11th Circuit, completely overturned her decision.
Wow.
And they were pretty forceful about it, too. They basically said that she had used flawed legal reasoning.
Oos.
And that she didn't have the authority to do what she did.
That's a pretty big deal, right? To be rebuked like that by a higher court,
Oh, yeah.
especially one considered pretty conservative.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if there's something more to this than just a difference of legal opinion.
And this wasn't an isolated incident, right?
Nope. There were other decisions in the Mar-a-Lago case, and even in other cases that raised similar concerns.
Like what? Give me another example.
Well, take, for instance, the Justice Department's attempts to compel Trump to reveal his legal strategy regarding the classified documents. Now, typically in cases involving national security, the government has a strong interest in protecting that information, and courts tend to give them a lot of leeway.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But Judge Cannon, she rejected their request.
Really?
Yeah, she argued that it would infringe on Trump's rights.
So even when national security was potentially at stake.
It seemed that way.
Wow.
And her critics, they argued that this, along with other rulings, demonstrated a pattern of behavior. It went beyond just being lenient.
What were they saying?
They were suggesting that she was actively trying to shield Trump from accountability, potentially trying to delay the case until after the 2024 election.
Okay, so now the stakes are getting really high. It's not just legal technicalities anymore. We're talking about the potential impact on a presidential election. And that's why some people started calling for her to step down, right?
Yes, absolutely. The calls for her recusal from the case because of a potential conflict of interest got much louder. And some even went further, suggesting that she should be removed from the bench entirely.
Whoa, hold on. Removal from the bench. That's a huge deal.
It is.
What would it even take to make that happen?
It's incredibly rare, and the process is very complex. You'd have to file formal complaints, investigations, and potentially even a vote in Congress.
So to even get to that point
Exactly.
shows just how seriously people were taking this. So we have this judge, conservative background, appointed by Trump, making these decisions that seem to benefit him,
Yeah.
even when higher courts are saying she's wrong. On the surface, I mean, it's not a good look, but is there another side to this story? Could there be, a legitimate explanation for her actions?
That's what we'll dig into in part 2 of this deep dive. We'll look at the arguments in her defense. We'll try to figure out if her rulings were truly unprecedented and really try to determine if there's a way to reconcile her actions with the principles of judicial impartiality.
All right, well, let's take a quick break, and then we'll get into all of that when we come back. Welcome back to Grifter or Gifted. We're still untangling this whole Judge Aileen Cannon situation. Last time, we kind of laid out the prosecution's case, controversial rulings, accusations of bias, even calls for her to be removed from the bench. But, every good story has two sides, right?
Right. We can't forget that she's a judge, sworn to uphold the Constitution, not to just, bow to public pressure or the political winds.
Okay, so let's hear the defense's side. What are her supporters saying about her actions? Are they just, blindly defending Trump, or is there something more to it?
Well, they argue that she's just applying the law, as she understands it. And it doesn't matter who's involved in the case.
Okay, but how do they explain those higher courts overturning some of her decisions? That doesn't exactly scream legal genius, does it?
Well, they say that those reversals don't automatically mean she was wrong, just that her interpretation of the law was different from the appeals courts. And it's not uncommon for legal minds to disagree, especially in those complex cases.
Okay, I guess that makes sense. But some of her decisions, I don't know, they seem pretty out there, even to people who aren't lawyers, like that whole special master thing. Was that really a standard legal move?
That's where it gets tricky. Her supporters say that while appointing a special master in this case may have been unusual, it wasn't completely unheard of. They point to a few other cases where special masters were used when they had to seize sensitive documents.
So they're saying she was technically operating within the rules, even if she, stretched them a bit further than most judges would.
Exactly. And they also highlight how thorough her reasoning was. She gave a very detailed explanation for each of her decisions. They argue that this shows she wasn't just acting randomly or out of bias. She was genuinely trying to apply the law fairly.
So they're painting her as this meticulous, by-the-book judge who's just getting a bad rap for making tough calls. But what about the timing of some of her rulings, especially the ones that seem to benefit Trump, like right before key moments in the election? That's a little hard to ignore, isn't it?
Yeah, they acknowledge that the timing wasn't great, but they insist that it was purely coincidental. They say she was just following the normal legal process, and any delays were because the case was so complex, not because she was trying to influence the election.
So it's do you believe she's really a stickler for the rules, or is she playing some kind of game? Are there any other concrete examples, besides the special master thing, where her defenders can point to her decisions and be like, see, she's just being fair?
Well, one they often bring up is her handling of a request from the Justice Department. They wanted to pierce attorney-client privilege in a totally different case, one that didn't involve Trump at all, and she denied their request. Said the government hadn't met the standard to do that.
But wait, wouldn't that decision, if we're using their logic, actually show that she's willing to rule against the government, even when it might be politically easier to side with them?
Exactly, and that's their point. They argue that this shows she's committed to upholding those legal principles, even when it means ruling against powerful interests. They say it shows she's not afraid to make those unpopular decisions if she thinks the law is on her side.
Okay, so we've got these two completely different stories. Is there any way to, bridge the gap? Can we find some middle ground between biased judge protecting Trump and principal jurist just doing her job?
It really comes down to how you interpret the evidence, right? If you already think Trump and his allies are corrupt, then you're going to see her actions in that light. But if you believe an innocent until proven guilty in due process, then you might be more willing to give her the benefit of the doubt.
It's almost like a legal Rorschach test. People see what they want to see based on what they already believe. But how do we move past that?
Yeah.
How can we even talk about Judge Cannon and what her case means without it turning into a political shouting match?
That is the big question. It's something we're going to try to tackle in part 3 of our deep dive. We'll look at the long-term impact of her rulings, Is there potential for damage to the judiciary? And what does all this mean for the balance of power in our democracy? Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Grifter or Gifted. Feels like we've been going back and forth on this Judge Aileen Cannon thing. And, well, it's time to kind of zoom out a little bit. Look at the bigger picture, What does her story tell us about the state of our justice system? And what could the lasting impact of her actions be?
That's what makes this so fascinating, because this whole thing, it's like a microcosm of a much bigger issue, the politicization of the judiciary.
Right. We hear that phrase thrown around a lot, but what does that even mean? Why should people care?
Well, in the simplest terms, it means that our courts, which are supposed to be impartial, calling balls and strikes, all that, are being seen as more and more influenced by, well, politics.
So it's like judges are making decisions based on their political beliefs instead of just the law.
Exactly.
And that's a problem because
it undermines the entire system. I mean, if people believe that the courts are rigged, that justice is basically for sale to the highest bidder or the most connected person, then the whole system starts to crumble.
Yeah, it's like that saying, justice must not only be done, but it must be seen to be done.
Right. Exactly.
If people don't trust the process, then the outcome doesn't really matter.
And Judge Cannon's case, whether or not you think she did anything wrong, it's become a symbol of this bigger problem.
So what you're saying is, even if other judges didn't agree with her rulings,
right,
they might still see what she did and be like, well, she got away with it.
It sets a precedent.
And they might be more likely to push the boundaries themselves.
Exactly.
Especially if it helps their side politically.
It creates this environment where justice is secondary to political maneuvering.
And that's dangerous.
Very dangerous.
So if Judge Cannon is like the canary in the coal mine, what can we do to prevent the whole mine from caving in? Can we restore faith in the judiciary? Can we make sure it stays independent and impartial?
There are no easy answers here. But this whole controversy, it's at least got people talking about judicial reform. Some are calling for stricter recusal rules, so judges can't preside over cases where there's even a hint of bias. Others want more transparency when choosing judges, trying to lessen the influence of politics in the process.
It seems like we need a system where judges are chosen because they're qualified and committed to the law, not because of who they know or their political views.
Absolutely. And it's not just about picking the right people. It's about what happens once they're on the bench. We need more accountability, maybe even new ways to investigate and discipline misconduct.
So lots of ideas, but it's going to take, a real effort from everyone to make any real changes.
Yeah, it'll require a shift in our political culture, away from this win-at-all-costs mentality that we see so much of. We need to remember that the judiciary is not a political weapon. It's the foundation of our democracy.
I like that, the foundation.
Mm-hmm.
So where does all of this leave Judge Aileen Cannon? What's her legacy going to be?
It's tough to say right now. Her career's not over. And the full impact of what she's done, well, we'll have to see. But one thing's for sure, this whole thing, it's a cautionary tale.
Yeah.
It shows just how fragile our institutions really are and how important it is to protect them.
Well said. Well, folks, there you have it. Another deep dive into a pretty controversial figure. As always, we're not here to tell you what to think, but hopefully we've given you something to think about. Grifter or Gifted, let us know what you think on social media. And until next time, keep those critical thinking caps on.